So I'm going to go ahead and get us started on this session. And I've been given the wonderful task of introducing our next speaker, who really does not need any introduction to APSA and its members. But Dr. Jim O'Neill finished his training in the late 1960s in Columbus. And during his talk today, he will also give us a tribute to Dr. Clatworthy, who was his mentor in Columbus. And most of you know that Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Grossfeld were co-residents together in Columbus. And in 1972, he became the first full-time pediatric surgeon at Vanderbilt. In 1980, he took the position of surgeon-in-chief at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia when Dr. Koop retired. And in 1993, he became chair of all the surgery departments at Vanderbilt. Most recently, he has been involved with the Vanderbilt Global Surgery Program in Punjabi, Kenya. He has been a mentor and a friend to me as I trained under him in Philadelphia. And I'm probably one of the few people who was a trainee under him and a future partner of his. So it's with a great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Jim O'Neill. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank Dr. Herschel and the program committee for accommodating me and my crazy schedule at this particular point in my life. My remarks today are primarily directed at the young people, the new members, because I would like you to understand the wonderful legacy and blessing you have received in being able to be a pediatric surgeon. And the question comes up, how did it happen? Who are the people involved? And what did they do? What were the trials and tribulations that they had? And so that's how I would like to start this discussion. Let's go from there. The very first sentences of my presidential address to this organization in 1989 were, as you see here, which outlines for you that in 1970, approximately 100 surgeons, a few less, devoted their practice to children's surgery. And they met at Pheasant Run in Chicago. I happened to be present at that meeting. And there were three stated goals. These have been paraphrased earlier. And they were to promote exemplary service to children. You must remember that at that time, service to children was not so great from the surgical point of view. To establish standards in training programs in the field, and to promote the development of new knowledge. These were very vague prescriptions at that time. The first officers were Dr. Robert Gross as president, Tom Holder, secretary, Al DeLorimer as treasurer, and then Fred R. Carey, Bob Izant, and Tig Chisholm as governors. Now, each of these people got those positions because they had made specific contributions to the field. Now, my sources of information are almost serendipitous because I happen to be thrown in a sense, and associated with these people that you can read on this slide. Now, my goal in doing this is to be able to highlight the people who had the vision and who worked so hard in terms of establishing this wonderful specialty. First of all, Dr. Clatworthy, and I will highlight his contributions. I trained with him. And then looking down the list is H. William Scott, who ended up being a general surgeon, but he had trained in Boston for 3 years, the epicenter of training at that time. Dr. Koop, whom I had many, many sessions with when he was Surgeon General, and I had come upon the scene in Philadelphia. Judson Randolph retired in Nashville, and I had the opportunity to have many lunches with him as he became disabled. So I would go with a sandwich for the two of us, and we would talk. And I learned a great deal about his views of international pediatric surgery, his connections, and his views of Drs. Gross and Ladd. Dr. Scott, by the way, was Dr. Clatworthy's chief resident at the Boston Children's Hospital. And then J. Alex Haller, he was very open with me, a good friend, also had a Vanderbilt background, and Alex was a storehouse of knowledge about the barriers, the people who were not very interested in helping pediatric surgery establish itself as a bona fide specialty. I've got lots and lots of writings that I've reviewed and a storehouse of letters and recollections. This is one of those. Here you see Dr. Ladd, and if you look down at the bottom, I hope you can read this. This is inscribed to Bill Clatworthy by Dr. Ladd, and he congratulates him and says, "From your former chief." So we have a timeline here. The second person, who was one of the first, was Herb Coe in Seattle, Washington. He was a general surgeon who became very discouraged by the standards of care in pediatric surgery in that part of the country. He later recruited Sandy Bill to join him, and he really started most of his work in the late 20s and early 30s. And then, and by the way, I'm indebted to Alan Anderson for these next pictures. This is Oswald Wyatt, who practiced in Minneapolis. He started a wonderful practice there that it still exists today. And it's interesting that Dr. Wyatt also was a general surgeon who on his own learned about pediatric surgery, but brought it back to Minneapolis and started an exemplary practice there. Now, Drs. Coe and Wyatt, their names were brought up to me by Dr. Clatworthy when I was a fellow. So it was well recognized back in the late 60s that there were three people who really started pediatric surgery in the United States. And they were the three I just mentioned, Dr. Ladd, Dr. Coe, and Dr. Wyatt. Dr. Coe was the first person to really devote all of his energy to pediatric surgery. But all of them had a hard road to hoe. Perhaps the most difficult was Dr. Ladd. It took many, many years. Now, this is an organizational meeting for the surgical section, and you can see various individuals. If you look at the seated row, you have Dr. Ladd on the left, Dr. Coe next, and then the next one over is Dr. Wyatt. So Dr. Coe was a great politician, if you will, and he was the first one to try to organize a meeting. But this was a really badly put together group. The second person standing on the left is Bob Bowman, who was a pediatrician, but did pediatric surgery. Then the fourth one standing from the left is Jesus Lozoya. The last one standing is Dr. Fontana from Uruguay. So you can see this is a motley group, if you will, but at least they were talking about standards for child care. The surgeons had let them know that nobody was interested in surgery and having pediatric surgeons around, And so they organized under the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was a start. Now, this is Dr. Wyatt, as you see standing here. Next to him is Tig Chisholm. Perhaps his greatest contribution, that is Dr. Chisholm, was a modern approach to exstrophy of the bladder. And the one on the left is Bernie Spencer. Now, Dr. Wyatt practiced, got these people settled, particularly Tig Chisholm, and then he went to work for an insurance company, which is sort of a harbinger of what's going on today with many young people, I must say. But this was a powerhouse of individuals, and of course, it's that way today. Now, the other part of the bookend for Dr. Clatworthy was this photograph of Dr. Gross. And Dr. Gross had a flowery way about him, and this is superlatives in this inscription, but they were all formal. William E. Ladd signed his William E. Ladd, and Robert E. Gross signed his Robert E. Gross. There was no Bob, there was no William, it was Dr. Ladd or Dr. Gross. So that also gives you the timing of these people. So Dr. Clatworthy trained under both these individuals. He was the one in the middle. And so you can tell Bill Scott was the chief resident for Dr. Clatworthy. There were many, many connections because there were relatively few people. Now, if you look at this number 2, Dr. Swenson and these others who came after those first 3, who basically were the first ones as good examples for the beginning of our specialty. But if you look at the general surgeons, they may have contributed the most. Bob Hyatt in New York, Bill Snyder in Los Angeles, Cliff Benson in Detroit, Dr. Scott in Nashville, and Mark Ravitch in New York and Baltimore. But they were general surgeons who, the first 3 devoted their energies totally to pediatric surgery after a number of years. And Dr. Scott and Dr. Ravitch always did general surgery, and Dr. Scott didn't continue to do it. He actually gave that to me. And then came all the others, and of course, that is going on today. Now, I'm taking this a little bit out of order because I want you to focus on what these things were. It turns out that, and this is an interesting background story, Bob Izant had trained in Boston and was recruited to Columbus to work with Dr. Clatworthy. They became very good friends, and subsequently, Dr. Izant was recruited to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and of course, he developed an outstanding service there at the Rainbow Baby and Children's Hospital. Now, Izant and Clatworthy were close friends. They both belonged to a fly fishing club in northern Ohio, and frequently would go off together fly fishing. On one of these occasions, Bob Izant said to Bill Clatworthy, "You know, I'm fed up with all of this. We try to get our boards, we try to do this, et cetera, and I'm frustrated with this." So Dr. Clatworthy, who was always a very wise mentor, said, "Well, Bob, why don't you talk to your chairman at Case Western Reserve? He's now chairman of the American Board of Surgery. Find out why we have not been able to get what we want in terms of recognition." And so that was Dr. William Holden, and he then listed the deficiencies that he saw in the applications that had come from our field. And these are the ones. And so what I'd like to do is briefly trace how these things were addressed so that eventually our specialty boards could be achieved. And of course, specialty boards were the sine qua non of recognition of any specialty, and it's always been that way before and to this day. So, first of all, we were accused of having no body of knowledge. We had no specialty organizations under the surgical umbrella. Pediatrics didn't count. And unfortunately, we had not developed to the point where we had substantive research in the field of pediatric surgery and no university involvement. And the meaning of that was, unless you had university involvement, you would not be able to mount multidisciplinary research as it should be. And then perhaps the greatest indictment was there was very little evidence that we had educational training programs with proof standards and metrics. And of course, the specialty boards. So the first four, just focus on those, have them in the back of your mind. Now, it was kind of good that this discussion came up because we were beginning to get recognition, or at least our forebears were. And you can see that the first ones were the ones I mentioned. Ladd contributed the basic information about malrotation, newborn surgery. That's why he's been called the father of newborn surgery. Gross with his work in cardiovascular surgery. Cameron Haight at Michigan and Roland Daniel at Vanderbilt, simultaneously and unknown to each other, did successful repairs, the primary repairs of esophageal atresia. Interestingly, Dr. Haight did his operations through the left chest, Dr. Daniel did his operations through the right chest, and as you know, the right chest is the one preferred today. Nonetheless, Dr. Haight made a major contribution in terms of numbers and survival. Swenson and Bill, Hirschsprung's disease, and then Bill Clatworthy, perhaps the first one to become heavily involved in surgical oncology. So he was the first one to report hepatectomy in children, and the other thing, perhaps the linchpin in terms of getting recognition, was that he was a serious educational leader, and he was interested in producing academic leaders. And if you look at the history of the outcome from his program, that was the way. This is a photograph of the first meeting of the surgical section. And here you're beginning to see additional individuals, which include Larry Pickett on the left, standing. Then there's Bill Clatworthy. Then there's Hugh Lynn. You are beginning, and on the bottom row you see Mark Ravitch, Bob Allen, Harvey Beardmore, and then of course there's Dr. Gross, who always liked bow ties. Now, the first thing on the list was that we had no body of knowledge to the perception of the members of the American Board of Surgery. And yet, in 1941, you had Dr. Ladd and Gross, and then the second one, the surgery of infancy and childhood. That one, interestingly, was on every general surgeon's shelf in his office, and yet we were accused of not having a body of knowledge. So subsequently, by 1962, the first edition of the two-volume came out, and it happened not so much because of its quality, but because of its timing, to be extremely important in terms of our recognition. So the literature, if you trace the time, you see you had Ladd and Gross, you had Gross, and then you had this group of people who started the first edition of the two-volume. And if you look, you have two of these people who were general surgeons, and you have two other people who were cardiac surgeons. Now, pediatric surgeons have always liked the idea that they were complete surgeons. Unfortunately, this may have worked against us at that time because there were too many other types of surgeons who resented the fact that we were doing all of their work, so to speak. But it was necessary for us to be able to establish that we had enough body of knowledge to produce things. So we were publishing in all kinds of surgical journals. Dr. Ravitch had a monthly feature of a couple of cases or something like that in the journal Surgery, but it was not enough. Now, the people who formed the Journal of Pediatric Surgery, now, you know, I'll have to tell you a little funny anecdote that goes with that. Dr. Herschel kind of dropped this on me after saying, I want you to talk about history. So I called my daughter Elizabeth, who happens to be an actress who's been in a number of Broadway productions. And so I said, I'm going to have to wear this thing. And she said, oh, that's a piece of cake, Dad. I did this every night that I'm performing. Well, I'm going to have to tell Elizabeth that she wasn't completely correct. Nonetheless, it was interesting that when the Journal of Pediatric Surgery was envisioned, it was envisioned primarily as a place to publish all of our papers from the surgical section, because there really was no home otherwise. Well, Dr. Clatworthy, on the other hand, said this is necessary, which is why he encouraged it, for us to show organized surgery that we're real and that we're contributing to the body of knowledge. So there were two different vantage points. One was strategic, one was practical. But you can see where Dr. Clatworthy had his orientation. And this led to things like Pediatric Surgery International and so forth. Well, this is Dr. Clatworthy, who was my chief. Dr. Scott was his chief resident at Boston Children's Hospital. They were very close friends. But overall, Dr. Clatworthy was he had exemplary brilliance. And as a diplomat, he was insightful and had great ability. So that he was a very good negotiator as things came along. Now, somebody had to have a vision to make all of this work. And I believe that it was Bill Clatworthy. And I'll try to show you a few things like this. But a lot of his strategy, which was intentional, was really based on the deficiencies that you saw. Now, he had this vision, and these are the quotes that came from various writings of his, and which really were his guidelines for how to help develop the specialty. And it's worth reading. Pediatric surgery and pediatric surgical education should have a firm scientific base. It shouldn't be an apprenticeship. Pediatric surgeons have the obligation to direct standards of care as well as to do surgery themselves. Need to be an activist. Children's specialists definitely need fewer walls and more bridges. Now, the reason he liked this was we needed friends in court to achieve what we wanted to achieve. And finally, if we desire to make pediatric surgery a true specialty, we must determine the limits and erect a structure. And this is exactly what he did and how he did the following. And you can read this. He supported the foundation of our scientific organizations, but along the way, he encouraged all of our young people to publish and present broadly throughout surgery. The most important linchpin in gaining recognition was that he established the educational standards of our training programs and the metrics for accreditation almost single-handedly. He encouraged active involvement in the mainstream of American surgery. He did not feel that pediatric surgery should be an isolated island. He felt that the only way that we could continue to advance pediatric surgery was to be in the mainstream. And he intentionally developed a strategy to achieve this. I told you what my sources of information were, and I have to say that, and this is an example, Dr. Clatworthy had a penchant for talking to his residents at 3 a.m. He would come in, you'd be doing a case, and he'd say, let's go sit in my office for a while. Well, on one of those occasions, he presented this document to me. It was, now the top part I've added to it as part of my collection, but this was his first draft. And you'll notice if you read the first paragraph that he mentioned this, that the standards were meant to conform to what is now the ACGME, the American College of Surgeons, and the American Board of Surgery. He knew who the target audience was. So after this was revised a little bit, it was later approved and moved on. But it's a precious document because it was the first description of what we wanted. Now, it was much broader than that. So Dr. Clatworthy and others developed international outreach. He developed connections with radiology and anesthesia. He was not alone in that, of course. There were many, many people that you've seen listed. He felt that pediatric surgery should not be localized in children's hospitals, but rather in university centers. So in 1969, there were 24 centers that had a pediatric surgeon, but by 1975, almost all. And the largest proportion of those came from Dr. Clatworthy. Involvement in multiple surgical organizations. Every one of his trainees knew that that's what they should do. So we were prodded to present at those forums. Now, we wanted an advisory council for pediatric surgery in the American College of Surgeons. We were turned down after 2 attempts. But thanks to Dr. Koop, we were able to achieve that. What Dr. Koop did was to talk to his chief, Isidore Rabdin, who was one of the most well-connected surgeons in the United States. For example, he was in the operating room when President Eisenhower was operated on. But he was tremendously influential. And Dr. Koop convinced him that we should get an advisory council. And indeed, that came to pass, thanks to Dr. Koop's efforts. I know a lot more about how he went about it and so forth from several conversations, but it was a major linchpin in gaining recognition, because being recognized by the American College of Surgeons with an advisory council was an endorsement of pediatric surgery as a bona fide surgical specialty. We had come of age because of that effort. Now, Dr. Clatworthy felt that we should be involved in multidisciplinary research, and every one of his trainees knew that. And so when he was placing people in various university centers, essentially populating them, it was something that he felt was a part of the strategy that would improve pediatric surgery, because the quality of surgery is based on scientific advance. It's never been any different, but it had begun to be recognized at that point. And then you can see publishing and so forth, and the founding of pediatric surgery. So for boards, I think most of you know this story. There were 5 attempts. I think there were only 3 serious ones. I've read the précis of every one of those. And you can see that in 1956, that was Dr. Koop who made that presentation. Those of you who know Dr. Koop or knew Dr. Koop know that he was a very direct, take charge kind of individual, and he did that. But unfortunately, even though he had that powerhouse committee behind him that you see listed here, it wasn't good enough at that time, but we were not mature enough. We hadn't organized. We hadn't done the things on that list. And that was something that taught us what we needed to do. And it was Bill Clatworthy who picked up on that and began to push for the rest of it. Now, nothing was easy. There were many barriers to recognition. Dr. Haller was very, very knowledgeable about this. There was a great deal of resistance to fragmentation of general surgery with the major surgical organizations in the United States. However, this was probably something that was sincere. They didn't want to see general surgery hurt. And in many ways, those attitudes we talk about today. And then there were proprietary things like concern for loss of scope of practice, and there were organizations that you see listed there, plus some others, actually put in their objections. And so we had to remember that we hadn't done our part completely, and we had limited organizational development, although it was underway. And then there was the attitude espoused by the Hopkins group, particularly Dr. Blaylock, that pediatric surgery was kind of a sidelight, a hobby of good general surgeon's practice. And even Dr. Ravitch felt this way to a certain extent. Fortunately, Dr. Haller showed him the way. So this is the timeline. It took a long time. Now we're 50 years. But you can see that it took a long time for our training programs to occur. The first real training program, which is an apprenticeship program, was started by Dr. Gross in Boston. But that matured into an honest-to-God training program once the work of the Clatworthy Committee and curriculum definition had come into play. And then, of course, APSA came along, which you heard about. We got the certificate of special competence, but that only happened because of these organizational things going before it. And then that even, you got Dr. Randolph developing an in-training exam related to the American Board of Surgery. Well, that's about as brief as I can make it in terms of going through this, but it's a fascinating story. There are a lot of personal interchanges that I think make a difference. Somebody had to have the vision, and in my view, it was Dr. Clatworthy, but of course he knew how to organize people, probably because of his manner. And so as we look at our new logo, you'll see that it's something there at the bottom says, saving lifetimes. Well, it's fitting when we talk about Dr. Clatworthy and our beginning to realize that that saving lifetimes comes from a quote by Dr. Clatworthy when he was giving a preface to a pediatric surgery symposium in the American Journal of Surgery. And so as we look at all of this, we must realize that we have been lucky. The purpose of pediatric surgery, and in my view, the beauty of pediatric surgery, is saving whole lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.